Welcome to Orlando Matters on your Saturday morning. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We have one guest for the entire half hour. It is a former state senator who wasn't very well known at the time he was also running for Congress. Well, he was running against a man from a political dynasty family, and he almost won. But then he went to prison. But before that, they made a documentary movie about his run for Congress. Take a look at this.
So this woman who was a friend of my grandma's, she got the first solicitation letter we sent during the campaign, and she calls my grandma and says, "Ida, this is wonderful. Your grandson, he's running for Congress." And my grandma, who's 96, said, "No, I don't think he's running for Congress. He's running for the state legislature." And the woman said, "Ida, I'm looking at the letter right here. He's running for U.S. Congress." And my grandma said, "Well, if he's really running for U.S. Congress, you ought to save your money."
I don't think the things that a person with the mind that he has should waste it on politics.
You know, my dad just pretty much laughed in my face.
He said, "I'm going to run for Dick Gephardt's spot in the U.S. House of Representatives." And I said, "What? Are you nuts?"
There was really 5 or 6 people who had a potential chance of winning. The first and foremost was Russ Carnahan, who has the name.
The Carnahan name in Missouri is like the Kennedy name in Massachusetts.
I'm not sure if he'd be in politics if he wasn't from a political family.
We've got all these dynasties all of a sudden. I mean, you know, Russ Carnahan thinks that he's going to entitled to the nomination. What's this with dynasties, and why can't we be like we used to be, where a milkman's son like Dick Gephardt could run and get elected?
The system is fundamentally flawed. It is broken.
Normally a pollster will fudge a little and say, "Well, Jeff, you got 5 or you're at 3. And I mean, this pollster said, "You're not even on here."
My name is Jeff Smith. I'm running for the congressional seat that Dick Gephardt is leaving.
I was surprised, even knew who Jeff.
All right, joining me today is Jeff Smith. He's the man behind that documentary movie, Can Mr. Smith Get to Washington Anymore? He's also the author of the new book, Mr. Smith Goes to Prison. Now, full disclosure, Jeff and I have known each other for, I'm guessing, about a decade. He used to be a guest on my radio show, so we may reminisce just a little bit here, but we'll try and take everybody along for the ride. Jeff, good to see you once again. Thanks for joining us up in New York today.
Thanks for having me on, John. I appreciate it.
All right, let's go back in time from the beginning. Why did you decide to get into politics in the first place?
You know, there were a few reasons. It was 2004, and we were at war in Iraq. I really disagreed strongly with going there in the first place, and yet my congressman, Dick Gephardt, had been a staunch supporter of going. And so, as part of a broad group of people in St. Louis who were strongly opposed to the war, I decided to put my name forward to run for Congress. There were other reasons as well, namely urban education. I had co-founded a charter school years before that, and was just really distressed about the inequality of opportunity available to kids in St. Louis who were, you know, born into poverty. And then finally, I felt like we needed more young people in public life. You know, seeing the amount of debt that we've racked up as a country, I think it's over $18 trillion now, which means that every baby born into the world owes about $60,000 as part of that debt. It just angered me. And I thought to myself, you know, we need more young people in Congress so that it's not a bunch of 65-year-olds who will never have to pay this debt, more young people who are actually going to be around in 30 or 40 years when a lot of this comes due. So those were the 3 main reasons I decided to run.
Now, your story, I think, resonates, or not resonates, but has so many people's attention is because you're an expert in African-American studies. That seems a little bit unusual for a white kid from a rather affluent suburb. You taught in the inner city. You taught at universities. You decide, I'm going to run for a position that has one of the biggest political names really in the state of Missouri and really in the country at that point. Is that why you think so many people are interested in your story? There's just a lot there, Jeff.
Yeah, as far as my choice of study, I had been a basketball player my whole life. My high school in suburban St. Louis received kids through a voluntary desegregation program who came on a bus out from inner city St. Louis. And by my senior year in high school, I was the only white guy starting on the team, and my teammates became my best friends. And I was just interested in the huge disparity between the schools that they went to before they got to come to our high school and the education I was fortunate enough to receive. And so that's what inspired me to want to learn Black history. I figured if anyone in this country is ever going to be a bridge between the two races, some people have to learn about the other side's history and culture. So Yeah, I suppose that probably interested some people, but more directly, with respect to the campaign, I ran against Russ Carnahan. His dad was a successful two-term governor who had died tragically in a plane crash. His mother was a U.S. Senator, his grandpa a congressman and ambassador, his sister Secretary of State. It was such a big name, and so the kind of David versus Goliath aspect of the story probably attracted some attention.
Okay, and by the way, the African American studies will come in later once we talk to you about your time behind bars. But also, you're running against, like you said, a political dynasty. So let's flash forward and talk about how you ended up with this book. Somebody comes to you, who you and I both know, and says, hey, I got some dirt, for lack of a better word, on the Carnahans, right? On him not showing up. How did that conversation...
Not showing up for work.
Not showing up for work.
State legislature.
Right. So how did that conversation turn into you ending up in prison?
Well, this man had approached two of my aides and told them, look, I know Carnahan had one of the worst attendance records when he was in the state legislature. Of 163 guys there, his voting record was like 161st. And so I want to put this information out there. And do you have some of the actual data for me to back it up? And my aides came to me and said, should we give this guy the information? And I replied, look, I don't want to know what you do. I knew there was something fishy about coordinating with a third party, but instead of telling my aides, don't talk to the guy, I said, don't tell me any details. They went ahead and gave him the information. He put out a postcard. His postcard lacked the requisite disclaimer, paid for by such and such campaign, and consequently, that opened it up to a complaint with the Federal Election Commission filed by my opponent, Mr. Carnahan. Although I lost the race by about 1 percentage point, Carnahan continued to pursue the Federal Election Commission complaint, and I responded to it with an affidavit denying any knowledge of the postcard, which was a lie, because I actually knew that my aides met with the guy who put it out, and so the affidavit was false. 5 years after that, when I was in the state Senate, my best friend told me that the guy who did the postcard was in some trouble with the feds. For the next couple months, we talked about how we might respond if the feds came to us and asked, did you have any involvement with this postcard? Because we thought that our friend might spill the beans. And little did I know that that entire time I was talking with my best friend about it, he was wearing a wire.
Because he was protecting himself as well, it sounds like. Now, by and large, this seems very minor. I mean, something missing from a postcard, maybe because you're running for office, you're supposed to know all this. I wouldn't have known that. I'm guessing most people wouldn't have known that. But that ends up getting you some time behind. We're going to stop down for just a second, talk more about what happens next and life behind bars. It's coming up right here on Orlando Matters. Welcome to Orlando Matters. Today we're talking prison reform. We're joined once again today by Jeff Smith. You can see the book right behind me. It is Mr. Smith Goes to Prison. He recently did a TED Talk. Here's a clip of that.
It was my first week in federal prison, and I was learning quickly that it wasn't what you see on TV. In fact, it was teeming with smart, ambitious men whose business instincts were in many cases as sharp as those of the CEOs who had wined and dined me 6 months earlier when I was a rising star in the Missouri Senate. Now, 95% of the guys that I was locked up with had been drug dealers on the outside. But when they talked about what they did, they talked about it in a different jargon, but the business concepts that they talked about weren't unlike those that you'd learn in a first-year MBA class at Wharton.
Take us through that time period between when you knew you were going behind bars and it actually happened, because quite frankly, that has to be terrifying.
Yeah, that's a difficult time. Well, I first found out that my best friend was wired, and I first drove to my parents' house. It was 5 minutes, but it was the longest 5 minutes of my life. I told my parents that I'd made a mistake 5 years earlier that was going to get me in a lot of trouble, maybe even prison. And my mom responded exactly how probably a lot of moms would at that point. She said, "Didn't I tell you not to run for public office?"
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, exactly. Then I went and saw my girlfriend at her job and told her that she should probably get her boxes. She'd moved into my house 2 days before that hadn't unpacked yet. And I told her she might want to pick up her stuff. And then I started meeting with my lawyers and hoping to find some agreement with the prosecutor that would keep me out of prison. Unfortunately, he was interested in people higher on the food chain than me, the Attorney General, a congressman, a U.S. Senator. And since I wasn't prepared to help the government on a fishing expedition to try to get these guys, he ended up going for the harshest possible sentence against me, looking for three or more years. But fortunately, we were able to get it to a year and a day.
Do you think that's why, Jeff? I mean, you're a nonviolent offender. You're not really a threat to anybody, and yet you end up going to prison. That seems like a total waste of money because it's going to cost, what, $35,000 a year to keep you behind bars? It would seem like a much more logical situation to put you in home confinement, let you teach, obviously punish you, but why prison?
Yeah, we had actually proposed in a brief to the court that I would teach for 2 years in a charter school that I had co-founded a few years, about a decade before that, and coach basketball every night after school, and then be confined to my house and on an electronic bracelet for the time that I wasn't teaching. If I would have done that for 2 years, I would have saved taxpayers about almost $250,000 by saving a salary, a public school teaching salary, and also the cost of incarceration. But unfortunately, the prosecutor was very angry that I didn't help him nab people higher on the food chain, and they tried to kind of throw the book at me. So then when I found out I was definitely going, how did I prepare? Well, I did a lot of reading, and I did a lot of push-ups.
Okay, you get to prison and not knowing what to expect. So what happens once you're actually behind bars?
Well, I remember the first day I went in, and I was going through the intake, and the woman, I was in deep southeastern Kentucky. I remember the woman, she said, height and weight. I told her, 5'6", 120. She said, education level. I said, PhD. She said, last profession. I said, state senator. And she replied, well, if you want to play games, play games. We got ones here that think they're Jesus Christ, so you ought to fit right in.
I'm sure she hears everything in the intake there.
So at first there was just sort of like disbelief that I was there in the first place, and then I met my cellie, the guy that I was living with. He had been locked up for most of the past 25 years on a dizzying array of charges, and he actually taught me a lot about how to operate in prison. There's a lot of things that you have to be careful of, and you can't ever be seen as being too close to the guards of the prison. Otherwise, people will think you're a snitch. And the only thing lower than a snitch in prison is a pedophile. So you really have to be careful not to run afoul of other prisoners.
Jeff, and as you start navigating your way through prison, you find out that you actually do have to break the law. You wrote about it in your book, or break the rules. You have to show them that you're not a snitch, that you're not one of the good guys, that you can actually be one of their boys, right? What did you do?
Well, prison forces people sort of into an underground economy. One of the common misconceptions about prison is that everyone's got it made. They've got 3 hots and a cot. But in reality, prisoners are destitute. They have no money. They have to pay for any little thing that they want. Soap, deodorant, toothpaste, toothbrush, you have to buy. And so prisoners are hustling, doing anything they can to make a buck, just to buy the necessities, let alone to have money for stamps or a phone call to loved ones. And as part of that, the other inmates who worked with me, I worked on the loading dock in the food warehouse at the prison. We moved about 35,000 pounds of food every day that came in to feed the thousands of people on the compound. They were stealing fruits and vegetables and other food and selling it when they got back to the yard. And about a week into my time there, I was tipped off that they were about to plant raw meat in my freezer jacket and frame me for stealing it, which could get you in a lot of trouble because stealing raw meat could end up poisoning everyone on the compound with E. coli. And they were going to do that because I was the only one not stealing. So they figured that I was probably going to rat them out for stealing. Consequently, I went ahead and started taking fruits and vegetables and then just passing them out when I got back to the yard to kind of build strategic alliances with some of the bigger guys to make sure that I would be protected.
I thought this was also interesting in the book, is that your first cellie was an African-American. Now, I bring back in your background because you're an expert in African-American studies. The white guys in prison didn't like the fact that you were friends with a lot of the black guys. Is there that much tension constantly going on in prison?
Yes. They say out in society the most segregated hour is like 10 o'clock on Sunday morning because people go to church and, you know, in a very segregated fashion in this country. But I had a lot of experience doing that as a politician. I went to black church all the time. And I will say that nothing I've ever encountered was more segregated than prison. Even in the black studies courses I took in college, sometimes had some white people or some Latinos, but in prison, it is considered verboten to eat with members of another race. And when I did that my first night there, I got a pretty stern talking to by the kind of so-called shot caller, one of the leaders of the whites on the compound.
Jeff, very quickly, and I know it's the one question a lot of people wonder about. I'm sure you wondered about it. It's probably the question you get often. We only have about a minute and a half here, so I don't want to go into it too deep. Everybody wonders about the rape behind bars. And reading your book, there are ways to protect yourself, but it is very common, isn't it?
It's incredibly common. You know, over 250,000 people are raped in our prisons every year, more than the number of women raped in society at large. And there's actually a relationship between the two. What do I mean by that? I mean that men who suffer from sexual assault inside of prison are much more likely to come out of prison upon release and attempt to tragically reclaim the manhood they perceive they lost in prison by raping women when they come out. So it's a huge problem. And it's something that, unfortunately, society tolerates and even laughs at. If you look at our crime shows, you know, prosecutors or detectives will joke, "Don't drop the soap" to someone who's on their way to prison. Unfortunately, even if you don't feel some sympathy for men who commit crimes and are raped in prison, you should feel that we've got to protect them, because the implications of the sexual assaults they suffer in prison end up affecting all of us in society through violence when they come back out.
All right, Jeff, hang on. We got one more break here. We're going to come back, talk about where we go from here. The cost it is costing all of us in society to keep this many people behind bars. All that coming up. It's Jeff Smith, the author of Mr. Smith Goes to Prison. We'll be right back here on Orlando Matters. Welcome back to Orlando Matters. Today we're talking about prison reform, and we have with us once again for this entire half hour Jeff Smith. He's the author of the book you see behind me, Mr. Smith Goes to Prison. He's a former lawmaker, ran for Congress, and as he just told the story, ended up behind bars. Jeff, one number I thought you pointed out was interested in the book was the billions of dollars we spend to keep this many people, nonviolent offenders, behind bars. It's almost like paying for each and every one of these guys to go to an Ivy League school for a year, more than $30,000 an inmate. And they come out, and a lot of times they're worse than ever. What do we do?
Well, the first thing we do to reduce recidivism rates, because we're not only paying an Ivy League tuition to incarcerate them, we're often paying it 2, 3, even 4 times for the same people, right? Because about 3 out of every 4 prisoners in this country upon release will reoffend within 3 years. And that's the problem that I am hoping to solve with some of the solutions that I propose in the book. The first thing we need to do is do more like what they do in Denmark, which is when you come into prison, they do an intake on you, they analyze what your skills and aptitudes are, what kind of job could you get on the outside, and then they spend your time in there helping train you and prepare you for that job, and hopefully they work to align your skills with the skills needed by employers in the communities to which you'll return. So Denmark does something like this, and they have a recidivism rate that is less than 1/5 of the American recidivism rate. The second thing we could do to reduce recidivism and reduce the $80 billion a year that we spend on our prisons is to help prisoners be in closer contact with their loved ones. As I said in an earlier session, John, prisoners have to spend between $1 and $2 a minute to stay in touch with their loved ones, and they frankly don't have the money to do that. Over the course of several years, most of them lose touch with everyone in their community, and they come back to their home totally alone with no community or family support. We've got guys who have been locked up 10, 15, 20 years. They receive no educational or vocational training in prison, and they come back to America's doorstep, 650,000 every year, to the same communities where they failed before, only now they have the added stigma of a prison record. 9 out of every 10 employers perform criminal background checks. 4 out of every 5 landlords perform background checks. And so these guys have no money, and yet almost every employer or landlord will refuse to hire or rent to them. So we've put up all these obstacles, and really, it's surprising to me that only 3 out of 4 reoffend if you think of all the obstacles that are in their place.
And Jeff, you said when you go out the door, a lot of these officers there say, well, some rather curt things, saying something like, hey, I'll see you in a year or so, right? They know these guys are going to reoffend because, as you said, this becomes your life. You feel more comfortable behind bars because you don't know how to function in society anymore, and you're going to end up homeless without a meal if you don't go back to prison.
That's what some people fear. And there was one guy I saw who had been locked up for about 15 years who seemed to be terrified at the prospect of being on the outside, and he ended up getting in a fight just before it was time for him to leave, and I think mouthing off at the correctional officers in order to stay longer. People, look, who have never worked at a legal job, have never had any preparation. When I worked with many of them on trying to put together resumes, they didn't know anyone they could list as a reference because they didn't know anyone who was legally employed. And we expect these guys with no skills to get a job. It's really asking a lot of people, and we do almost nothing to make it easier for them. So even if you don't feel compassion to these guys, for your own self-interest and your own pocketbook, you should want to train them so we don't have to keep paying for them after they reoffend. Look, you mentioned the thing that COs tell inmates on their way out. They often say, hey, look, see you in a few months. It's jackasses like you that remind me that I'll always have a job. Well, you know, that's the kind of attitude, that kind of inhumane treatment of prisoners ensures that they won't act as humans should act and civilized people should act when they get out.
You know, and I think even hardline Republicans, very conservative, are now starting to realize that this is not the right way to go about this because, as you said, you're spending $80 billion a year. Well, fiscal conservatives should be saying, wait a second, I don't want to spend that much money. But it is big business. There are people who want to keep this cycle going, aren't there?
Oh, well, there's vendors. There's all the people that sell food into the warehouse. I mean, I watched it. You know, I unloaded all that food with 6 other guys. Every, item of food that came into the compound, I saw how much money the vendors were making. The people who sell into the prison commissary or canteen are making tons of money because all the items are marked up 40 to 50% before prisoners pay for them. I told you about the phone calls, which are a huge profit center for companies, and then kickbacks are given from the companies to the prisons from their profits. Really, there's a huge system where a lot of companies are making tons of money on the backs of some of the most vulnerable people in society. So you're right, though. Fiscal conservatives have had enough. You see Southern Republican governors like Rick Perry in Texas, Nathan Deal in Georgia, Nikki Haley in South Carolina that have started prison reform, closed some prisons, and are realizing that this revolving door, this endless cycle, isn't doing anyone any good.
Yeah, well, Jeff, the numbers are skyrocketing. People incarcerated, even nonviolent offenders who I don't think should even be behind bars, find other ways to go about it. We've got about a minute left. Do you think anything's going to happen with an election year coming up, knowing that we need to change this for fiscal reasons, for moral reasons, for whatever reason you might want to come up with?
John, I'm optimistic that if not in the next year, sometime in the next few years, we're going to see federal legislation on this. You've got 3 major philosophical strands of the Republican Party, and they all have a big reason to support prison reform and criminal justice reform. Libertarian conservatives like Rand Paul want to decriminalize drugs, or at least marijuana, medically, and they want to get rid of the influence of big government surveillance on every aspect of people's personal lives. Fiscal conservatives, as we just discussed, want to save money, and Christian conservatives want to redeem the souls of those who are in prison. So even hardline conservatives have come around on this issue. The question is, will Democrats meet them in the middle and find some compromise that can save billions of dollars and thousands of people's lives and help them recover their lost potential?
Jeff, it's been an honor today having you back on. The book is called Mr. Smith Goes to Prison. I know it's out there in all the normal bookstores. Pick it up. It's a great read. You're going to plow through it. Jeff, as always, great to talk to you, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Great to talk to you too, John. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for joining us for Orlando Matters today. I want to thank my guest, Jeff Smith. You see the book right behind me, Mr. Smith Goes to Prison. It's a great read. You can also check out his documentary, Can Mr. Smith Get to Washington Anymore? It's out there online. Just Google search that and you'll find it. Remember, the news on our sister station, Fox 35, begins at 8 o'clock. Have a great weekend. We hope to see you back here next week for another Orlando Matters. Now get out and enjoy your Saturday morning.